Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Anthony, for taking the time again to join us. It's great to meet you. I've heard your name a lot. For the sake of the recording, today's date is February 10th, 2022. My name is Kasari Govender. I'm BC's Human Rights Commissioner, and I am joining you today from Vancouver, from what's the unceded and traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I am joined today by Sarah Kahn, who's our General Counsel, Carly Hyman, staff lawyer for investigations and inquiries, Catherine Pope, who's with our communications team, and you've just met Emily Chan, one of our engagement advisors. So as you know, we're here today to address hate in BC during the pandemic and in future states of crisis. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes before passing it over to you to talk about the parameters of the inquiry, including the terms of reference, how we are defining hate incidents, and the questions that we just have provided to guide your presentation today. The inquiry was initiated on August 18th, 2021, in response to the significant increase in reported hate-related incidents, including online incidents in BC since the start of the pandemic in early 2020. In this inquiry, we will be examining and making recommendations on the following key questions. What has caused the apparent rise in hate incidents in BC experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic? What kinds of hate have individuals and communities in BC experienced during the pandemic, and how have these experiences impacted them? And then how can we address, eliminate, or prevent hate incidents during times of crisis and beyond? And there's a couple different components of that. How effectively have our public and private institutions responded to hate during the pandemic? And then how effective is our public policy and law in addressing hate? So Sarah will post the full definition of hate incidents for your reference in the chat. In sum, for the purposes of the inquiry, hate incidents are defined as actions and speech rooted in prejudice that, in the view of the person who has experienced it or witnessed it, are aimed at that person or group because of a personal characteristic of theirs, and be intended to or does significantly harm that person or the group they belong to. So we're speaking to you today as part of our evidence gathering phase of the inquiry, and based on all the stories and information that we hear and the research that we do, we anticipate releasing a report in fall of this year. In that report, we will make some recommendations about how to prevent and address hate during the pandemic, post-pandemic, and in future states of crisis. So your participation today is critical for the inquiry's success. Like Emily, I want to recognize that I know you do this for a living, but that talking about hate for all of us can be difficult, and encourage you to do whatever you need to do. And know there will be no harm done in terms of your presentation if you need to take a moment. This session is conducted informally, so you're not being asked to share your submission under oath or affirmation, but we're just taking the opportunity to remind everybody of the importance of truthful and accurate submissions to the work that we're trying to do here together. As you know, this session is being recorded so that my office has a record of it, and I'll be relying on the information that we hear from you and from others to inform my analysis, the inquiry report, and the recommendations. I will identify the source of the information I rely on in my final report, but beyond that, this session will be kept confidential unless up to the extent that you have provided us with consent to share it, including posting any of this information on the inquiry website. The benefit of sharing your presentation is to enable others to learn from your experiences, the data that you share, the information that we're going to learn from you today. So we've provided you with some questions to guide your presentation, and Sarah will post those as well in the chat for your reference. The questions today are tell us a little bit about the agency that you represent. How has your agency observed or experienced hate that is targeted towards those you represent, serve, or work for? Can you share with us any evidence, the stories, or the data about the nature and frequency of such incidents, recognizing that, of course, we're also going to get a data in written form from the RCMP. That's we're looking really both prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and then comparing that to the pandemic time. There, we've listed some specifics there as well. What role do you think the pandemic has played in the reported rise of hate in BC? Please tell us about any actions that the RCMP has taken to prevent, address, or respond to hate. Were any of these actions initiated or modified during the pandemic? Can you please share any evidence you have of the effectiveness of these actions, including the strengths of your response to hate, both before and during the pandemic, the challenges you faced, the opportunities you've identified? How has your agency tracked and addressed the differential impact of hate during the pandemic on different populations? And is there anything else you'd like to add to inform our recommendations as we go forward? So we have about 30 minutes for your presentation today, and at the conclusion of that, there'll be about 15 minutes for Sarah and I to ask you some questions. Sarah will give you a prompt a few minutes before the end of that 30 minutes, just in the chat in case you want to keep an eye in there. So thank you again for joining us today, taking the time to share your experiences and the information that you have with us today. It really is incredibly important to the work we're doing. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Anthony.
Thanks again for having me. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the Kakite First Nations. So I'm a regular member of the RCMP. I hold I'm a non-commissioned officer. I hold the rank of corporal. I've had that rank since I came into my current position, which is the NCO in charge of BC hate crimes. We're the provincial hate crime investigative agency. We're a two-person unit, which is an integrated unit, myself being the RCMP member, and then municipal police officer seconded from New Westminster Police Department. We have the BC hate crime, formerly the BC hate crime team, has been in existence since 1996 and has been a two-person unit since that time. We have a mandate to provide investigative support and guidance to essentially any police department or RCMP detachment or RCMP unit, for that matter, in British Columbia, with the exception being the Vancouver Police Department, which has its own full-time hate crime investigator, and also has some other investigative resources that support hate crime investigations there. And then Victoria Police also has a hate crime coordinator position, so not a full-time hate crime investigator. So essentially, outside of both those agencies, we're a provincial tool that is able to assist with investigations, provide assessments on, whether a hate crime has occurred or a hate propaganda offense has occurred. We will lead investigations in some circumstances as well, including in cases of multi-jurisdictional offenses, and then also hate propaganda investigations under Section 319 or 318 of the Criminal Code, which tend to be more complex in nature. So as far as the pandemic, the advent of the pandemic, and hate crime and hate incidents in BC, what I can tell you is that essentially when the first lockdown happened, which was in March of 2020 in British Columbia, within a few weeks, there started to be, just in general, reports in the media about Chinese or Asian people being targeted for, hate-related actions just out in the public domain. There are a few high-profile incidents that were widely covered in media, One was an elderly gentleman in Vancouver. This was a Vancouver Police Department investigation, but who was sort of thrown out the door of a convenience store. A few months later, again, another Vancouver police investigation, an Asian female being just randomly punched in the face. There are a number of other person offenses like that. And just in general, what was being sort of discussed is like just, strangers yelling at strangers, using racial slurs out in public. And, so anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, or in some cases, victims who weren't Chinese or Asian, or from an Asian background, but appeared, as far as the suspect was concerned, they made the determination that they probably were from that nationality or ethnic group. And, so saying racist things in that context, saying hateful things in that context, but also referencing the pandemic itself, like saying, you're responsible for COVID-19, or there are any number of different things, sort of combinations of words that were used. There are a few that were used, more commonly than others. So this was being reported in the media, and, quickly we were attempting to corroborate this through data, and which we have an ability to do, our unit does, because we review all police files in BC that are flagged for hate. The RCMP and municipal police agencies have a slightly different way of doing that in our police record system, but in any event, we capture all that data. And that's, again, one of our functions, is to sort of have an idea of what's going on in British Columbia at any given time in terms of hate. So what became clear over the course of about 8 weeks, so by early May of 2020, was that this was, there was a significant surge in this type of incident in BC. It was very much targeted toward, it was anti-Chinese or anti-Asian in general, racism and hate. And it had a clear nexus to COVID-19 in that that was just something that was being continually referenced. The Lower Mainland saw, probably the biggest, proportionately sort of the biggest surge in that type of activity, with a concentration being in the city of Vancouver itself, so under VPD jurisdiction. And but I mean, we saw increases all over the province. And what we know about hate crime in Canada is it's very reactive to domestic events, to international events, to geopolitical events. There can be implications for hate crimes and hate incidents in Canada on the basis of things that happen, outside of this country, that are, have some sort of nexus to a particular ethnic group. So I think, and this is a qualitative assessment, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I may reference this later too, but I think that what we can expect in Canada is that any historically marginalized group, as is the case with Chinese Canadians or Asian Canadians in general, they will be targeted, like those groups will be targeted for hatred, and it probably will manifest, most in hate type incidents. So again, sort of that example we saw over and over during especially the first lockdown, was strangers yelling at strangers in the street. Sometimes meeting the elements of a criminal offense and sometimes not. So that trend really, I would say sort of peaked in about May 2020. And then what the data showed us was that it started a downward trend, into summer and early fall of 2020. And then after that time, through 2021, what we saw was in the data, and again, I stress that this isn't official data. This is the data that we keep track of. Is that it essentially returned to, for lack of a better description, normal? Because the fact is that anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate happens in BC even outside of a pandemic. But the data returned to sort of numbers or levels that we were more familiar with prior to March of 2020. And that continues to be the case. And what I can tell you now is that, in the context of anti-Chinese or anti-Asian hate in BC, that we've seen very, very few references to COVID-19 in the same breath. And that's been the case for a while. So it's almost as though that it was the advent of the first lockdown that really drove that trend. And I mean, unfortunately, I think is also born out of the narrative that was circulated that Chinese people or Asian people were somehow responsible for the virus. Like that was what I think informed a lot of that, of those incidents and those crimes. I think I've probably sort of answered what role the pandemic has played in the reported rise of hate in BC. And I mean, what I can tell you is that certainly that was really the significant hate-related event that we've seen in the whole course of the pandemic. Again, since probably early fall of 2020, even with the second wave and the lockdown there, we did not see the kind of surge in numbers that we saw during the first lockdown. I think that I'll just add that, and this is more qualitative than anything else, and I don't want to. This is really just based on the data that I saw at the time. Is that probably part of the reason for the numbers that we saw in the Lower Mainland and the city of Vancouver specifically does have to some degree a nexus to the downtown east side. I would say that disproportionately to the rest of British Columbia, like that, the downtown area and certainly the downtown east side probably saw a disproportionate number of hate incidents and hate crimes. And I think that I mean, the fact of the matter is that a lot of the community that lives in the downtown east side are frequently clients of the police, frequently involved in criminal activity, and unfortunately, in this case, that also I think that there's a number of things there, but I think that the sort of social pressure that the first lockdown brought on probably created unique pressures for people living in that community. And then with the fact that Chinatown was there, like essentially right there as well, that created some conditions for a disproportionate number of hate incidents and hate crimes there. Of course, there's a mental health component. I'm not saying that hate is a result of mental health problems, but I'm saying that there are parallels there that probably led to higher numbers in the city of Vancouver, and then specifically in that kind of area. Again, this is an assessment, almost 2 years down the road from where I'm standing, but it's very difficult to say whether the pandemic, you know, made people who, you know, did not harbor any kind of racism or hatred against Chinese people or Asian people in general. Like if that created a sort of like a new group of people who engaged in racist activity, or if it really just stripped away, you know, barriers for people who already had those opinions. My guess is that it's mostly the latter. I think that you know, systemic racism exists, you know, in relation to, you know, pretty much every identifiable group defined under the law in Canada, and that it's not this is not at all meant as a justification, but I think that the pressures of the pandemic and the lockdown exposed racism and hate here in a way that it just might not have otherwise, and that those you know, same kind of feelings or opinions that people have are just sort of better kept under wraps without those kind of unique pressures that the lockdown brought on. So about what we did in terms of you know, in responding to this, we you know, we strictly from where I was at the time, and at the time I was working on my own in the unit, I looked at a lot of police files in a way that I never have before. I had to make more referrals to police of like different police agencies of jurisdiction than I ever had before or have since. Basically getting reports, you know, directly from members of the public. And we're not talking about a huge number, because typically the public will report things to their local police of jurisdiction. But I also received reports, had to forward, you know, refer people or loop in, you know, different departments to a particular incident or crime that had occurred. Provided a lot of reports to, you know, internally to E-Division RCMP, and then also to government ministries. And that was unique too. Like we've had inquiries from government in the past to the RCMP and our unit to say, you know, essentially, can you substantiate these reports that we're hearing about, you know, what's going on? And so we did that a few times, and during, you know, that period, really spring, early summer of 2020, that was unique. And really, once we had established that there was an increase that appeared to, you know, and that appeared to be on an upward trend, we put the information out to, you know, our front line, not just RCMP, but all municipal police agencies in BC as well, to say, this is what we're seeing. Like we're literally seeing a rise in anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents in, you know, since the pandemic kind of hit, since the lockdown began, as an awareness piece that, you know, these are people in the communities who are vulnerable. Know the community, know your local community, you know, points of vulnerability to try and prevent further victimization. So that was mainly our function, and then also coordinating with other police departments, notably Vancouver Police Department, to sort of make sure that we're keeping on top of everything that was happening. So, I mean, as far as like, you know, modifications, I mean, it was essentially the same job that we always do, except on, on steroids, for lack of a better description. Like, it just, there's so much more work for us to do collectively during that, especially during that particular time period. As far as the effectiveness of the actions go, I mean, I think that, so if you look at the definition that the commission's using for hate incidents, which is, it's a really, as far as I'm concerned, it's a really good definition for what that describes. When we talk about hate crime in Canada, we're talking about a few different things at once. We're talking about hate motivated crime, like things that meet the elements of a criminal offense. We're talking about hate propaganda offenses. And we're talking about hate incidents. So it basically describes a range of things that are either criminal or, objectively problematic, that have a nexus to hate. So when again, that the term hate crime is loosely used to describe a number of different things, and most of what happened, like really overwhelmingly what happened, was an increase in hate motivated crime, and then probably even more so in terms of hate motivated incidents. So the definition that the commission's using for incidents describes things that may not meet the elements of a criminal offense, but they're the type of thing that we are always asking the public to report to the police, because the police want to be able to make a determination about whether or not the elements of an offense have been met. So the scale of hate incidents and things that may or may not be criminal, again, was like that accounted for the huge surge in numbers that we saw. And it's not, I hesitate to say we take solace in anything to do with any aspect of hate incidents or crimes in BC. But one of the biggest questions that people often have is, to what extent was there coordination of these things, or was it organized by a group or anything like that? And the answer is that almost never happens. And that was also the case during the pandemic. What we're talking about is individuals, with maybe a couple of exceptions here or there, who, likely have some pre-existing hate, prejudice, or bias toward a certain group, and may not otherwise kind of act out on them, but that the conditions of the pandemic and the lockdown made them act out in ways that they may not otherwise would have. Some of those incidents that I described at the beginning, the high profile assaults that happened in Vancouver, would those have happened were it not for the pandemic? I mean, it's pretty impossible to say, but I think that there's a case for saying, those types of incidents in BC are still rare, and they happened a lot more than average during that unique period of time that we saw. But those were the actions of individuals. They weren't. There's very little evidence to say that more than maybe a handful were planned things, like thought out ahead of time, and that they were more reactive to, just the presence of somebody who appeared a certain way, crossing the path of a particular suspect. So the point that I'm making here is that just in general, dealing with hate motivated crimes and incidents it's really hard to stop from a law enforcement standpoint, because what you're really talking about is, stopping people from being racist. That's not something that the police have much of an ability to do. Like that's a systemic, that's a societal problem. And the police certainly have a hand in that, but their role is limited in terms of actually doing anything about it. From a practical standpoint, you know, in terms of dealing with a situation like this again, from a law enforcement standpoint, the best practical things that could be done that could mitigate some of this is deploying additional resources to places where we know this is more likely to occur. So, you know, if we could have gone back in time and deployed more police resources and presence to Chinatown and Vancouver, probably downtown Vancouver in general, and then the transit system all over the city, that would have probably led to fewer crimes and certainly, well, I don't know about certainly fewer incidents, but it probably would have had a deterrent effect on that. Again, like if there's a geopolitical event or some sort of disaster or a pandemic that emanates out of a certain part of the world, there will be narratives that emerge that, you know, it's a certain identifiable group is responsible, and it will impact, you know, people who are from that, you know, national or ethnic background, or people who even just appear to be, to certain people to be from that background. Like that'll happen. And and there are other examples beyond the experience of Chinese and Asian Canadians in the pandemic that have happened in Canada in the past that tells us that that's a likelihood. I think to question 6, have we tracked and addressed differential impact of hate during the pandemic? I think that because of the pandemic, because of what we saw in terms of Chinese, you know, anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate, we're going to be more alive to those possibilities. I think that was really unique about, notwithstanding how we've seen the way hate crime react in Canada in the past before 2020 in this context. What we had never seen before was the speed that it increased at. Like that rate was just like nothing anyone had ever seen. I'd certainly never seen, was really quite taken aback by it. Again, it's learning from those experiences collectively in law enforcement about how we can not be in such a reactive position and better meet the expectations of the public to make sure that that, you know, the public feels safe in a situation that already feels pretty unsafe. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much what I'd like to put forward for my submission. As far as recommendations, I mean, I think that I like what the province has done over the past 4 years in terms of having an anti-racism strategy. You know, just the Resilience BC website alone is a pretty good resource that didn't exist before. I think that, you know, it's one of those things where could there be more time and investment in all those things from the, you know, government and partners and including the police? Certainly there could be. I'd like to see every police unit in British Columbia is going to say that they're under resourced because pretty much everybody has just run off their feet doing their different jobs. I'm no exception. I'd like to see more resourcing into, you know, hate crime investigations to raise the profile, because the expectation of the public is that the police take this very seriously, and we do. but it makes it even easier to take it seriously when you have more people to put the work in. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was very, very helpful. I have a long list of questions, so we'll just see how many we can get through. You certainly gave rise to lots of curiosities for me, if I can say it that way. Maybe I'll just start at the end there. I'm curious whether you, in terms of the recommendations or potential recommendations, whether you think that the criminal law standard that you need to work with is sufficient to meet to address the kind of reports that you are getting in over that time or continue to get in. Is it an obstacle to you moving forward, or does it feel like it meets the definition? I appreciate that you appreciated our definition of a hate incident, which is obviously broader.
I think that the difficulty with hate incidents and like really anything to do with speech, use of racial slurs, random verbal attacks. The difficulty always is going to be, it's going to run up against the most powerful piece of legislation we have in the country in the Charter and Section 2, freedom of expression. We've seen cases in the past in British Columbia where the expectation is that from the public, and it's a reasonable expectation, these are very offensive, very hurtful words. They're damaging to a community just beyond an individual. And accepting that the Charter can be a protection for that kind of speech is not an easy thing for a lot of people to hear. It's not an easy thing to say either. So I think that the important thing, though, to remember is that every single hate incident, because that's principally sort of what the inquiry is interested in, has to be assessed case by case, because some people may be victimized and feel upset by it, but it's possible that beyond that, it does meet the elements of a criminal offense, and it really depends on who the victim is, who the suspect is, what is the context, what are the circumstances, where are they when it happens. Like, there's a lot of factors that can play into that. So we don't want to say that just, being victimized by, use of a racial slur by a stranger will not be a criminal offense. It may be. The police may have an ability to have a recourse through the law there. Where they don't, the police always have an ability to go and talk to people about their behavior. And I think that's a big thing that the law enforcement community needs to understand, is that all of these things need to be investigated properly, but just in general, taken seriously, so that there is something that can be done for each victim in incidents, in hate incidents specifically. And the federal government, it was a bill that died with the last election, but I'm sure it's going to be revived to amend the criminal code to essentially make it a little more nimble in terms of what the police are able to do, and speaking probably specifically to online spaces, because the laws as they are, I would say good, but they're a little outmoded. They were written more to deal with text and hard copy documents, and not so much with the electronic or virtual environment. So what I'm hoping is that gets revived, and that's going to be another tool for us to use. I think that the other thing is that there's probably more of an appetite, certainly in British Columbia, by Crown Counsel to litigate certain things to see if to sort of potentially figure out where the line is between a crime and an incident, because I think that just from a societal standpoint in Canada, our expectations around that collectively are different than they were about 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I wondered if you have, I appreciate what you said that the hate incidents you've seen for the most part are in actions of individuals. I wondered if you have seen an increase in extremist activity like by Soldiers of Odin or any of those kinds of extremist groups. If that's something you're able to speak to, I don't know if that falls.
Yeah, I would not describe Soldiers of Odin as an extremist group.
Okay.
I would there are extremist groups, and I have some understanding of what Soldiers of Odin about, but I wouldn't describe um, that as them as an extremist group. Um, are so it's important to remember the police don't investigate groups, right? Because groups are um, being, identifying yourself as part of a group. Uh, it would be charter protected activity. It would be freedom of expression. Even using, saying I'm a member of a terrorist organization, like a listed terrorist entity in Canada, is also protected as freedom of expression. It's that you have to take some sort of action in order to cross the line into criminality. So we investigate individuals or small groups of individuals who may or may not identify, under a particular moniker or title. So that with that preface to that said, I would say that um, during the pandemic and in relation specifically to what we saw in terms of a rise of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate crime, uh, we really did not see any evidence of hate crimes or incidents perpetrated by people who are operating under a group name, even individually. And and that's not to say that sort of thing, doesn't happen or hasn't happened in BC, but that really wasn't the profile at all of hate incidents in BC in relation to what the inquiry is looking at.
Thank you. Um, can you talk about have you seen other increases of hate that you could correlate to other crises in BC? Like obviously within our lifetime, we haven't faced something like this before, but are you able to track any increases according to, floods or forest fires or other crises that may be more localized in a community?
That's a really good question. So I think the first part of that is that I hinted toward, we've seen this before, the way that hate crime is reactive in Canada, and really even in, so 2020 was so interesting because right ahead of COVID, and the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate that we saw rise out of that, people often forget that there was, blockade activity of a kind that we hadn't seen in Canada for a while. So rail blockades by Indigenous groups who were showing solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, and anti-pipeline activism. And there was a rise in anti-Indigenous hate crimes and incidents in that short period that sort of suddenly disappeared, because I mean the blockade activity disappeared with the pandemic. Subsequent to the start of the pandemic, there was the murder of George Floyd. And as a result of that, there was a rise in anti-Black incidents and crimes in British Columbia and in Canada. Previously in years past, we've seen other similar things happen, but basically any type of high profile incident, any type of high profile event that relates to a particular identifiable group that's historically marginalized in Canada, you'll see hate crime and incidents rise, relative to that group, which is a disturbing thing to say. So I think sort of to your question about, in local communities or things happening in a local community or like a natural disaster, in the time that I've been here, we haven't really seen anything like that. But I would say that that's a possibility that we have to be alive to. And I think probably, in the context of resource shortages, whether water, food, other pressures that are brought on by natural disasters that we've seen in BC in recent times, whether wildfires or floods, I think those things could happen. And I think those things, because empirically we've seen how other events affect hate crime and incidents in Canada. So, I think that there's a probability that those could happen, depending on a particular community or the conditions in the province as a whole.
Thank you. Really interesting. I know we're out of time, and so maybe just see if you have a quick answer to this last one. But it was the second time you said that hate crime in Canada is reactive, and I wondered if you see that as different than hate crime in other countries, or if you're just being specific because that's your experience here.
Well, what I know generally is that, in the West, that's pretty much going to be the same thing. Certainly, that's what happened in the States. Happened in other Western countries too. Like, I think that, to the extent that the profile of Western countries has been, North America specifically has been colonialism. So you have, historically marginalized groups, other, groups that immigrated to Canada, the United States, that were, historically marginalized, mistreated. And I think that those are unique, societal factors in North America for sure, that have an impact on how hate, plays out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was incredibly useful. I really appreciate you contributing your time, and I know not just here, but in general to the work that we've done here. So we will let you go and try not to keep you any longer. But I'm sure we'll have more conversations. You'll have more conversations with Sarah and Carly in the months to come.
Thanks so much. Really, I'm glad the inquiry's happening, and really glad to contribute.
Thank you, Anthony. Emily, did you want to wrap up with any last comments?
I just wanted to say a couple of quick things. One is that we do have a deadline for March 31st for any other written or video submissions. So if you did want to follow up with anything, or if you know anyone that would like to, we do have that deadline coming up. And I think you for the consent form didn't consent to posting the recording, but just in case, we are going to notify all the presenters when the recordings are ready to post. So if you wanted to review it and change your mind, you're welcome to do that at that point. And again, just wanted to thank you again. Really appreciated your honesty and your clarity as well with everything you've shared. So thank you so much again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anthony. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye, Anthony.
Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah.